In the previous videos, we looked at the post-World War II boom in terms of kind of the evolution of sponsorship and Andy Granatelli and these big ideas and these automotive-related sponsors. We also looked at the role of death, role of technology, a little bit there in the rear engine revolution, didn't do too much. So we kind of focus in on the constructors and suppliers, a little bit of the entrants and casualties. But now we're going to focus in on sanctioning bodies, events, venues, and really look at also participants and consumption as well. I will save distribution for the next video when we talk about the golden years. But in this particular video here, we're going to focus in on why there were so many new sanctioning bodies, why the number of participants increased, why there was a rapid increase in the numbers, but also the types of race events. Now, I'm not a big fan of organization. I've been to one too many meetings that were organized in my day for no reason, but organization is a good thing. We need regulations. Just think of the example of drag racing. Drag racing, what's the regulation? How do we know two cars it's a fair competition? How do we know it's safe? How do we know it's going to be, there's no corruption? That's the whole idea of the organization, these sanctioning bodies. They do more than just put on the show. They make sure safety is in order. They make sure that they try to make sure there's no corruption. So these governing bodies, we can also see a rapid increase in the numbers of them soon after World War II. Once again, this theme post-World War II boom. So we have the Sports Car Club of America there. The FIA is the kind of the world governing body, as we know it as today, the Federation de International Automobile. The APBA is hydroplane, boat racing. NASCAR, of course, the National Association of Stock Car Auto Racing. That's a bit redundant. Stock Car Auto Racing. Car Auto. Anyway, FIM, that's Federation de International Motorcycle. So motorcycles, Formula One, of course, National Hot Rod Association, that's the big drag racing association, ARCA, a stock car racing association, kind of more of a regional level. United States Auto Clubs mostly does open wheel, grassroots level, so that'd be sprint cars, and midget cars from our previous motorsport terminology discussion. IKF, that's karting. Another ACCUS, this is very, very important. No one really knows about it here, which is kind of important for the United States. This is actually the governing body for all automobile racing in the United States. And so it's actually the governing body for IndyCar, for NASCAR, for IMSA, for SCCA, for NHRA, for USAC. The governing body of them all, going through the World Karting Association as well, is actually ACUS. So they're actually based there in Colorado. No one really knows that. They're kind of unheard of. And so FIA is the governing body at the global level. At the national level, the United States level, it's ACUS, which stands for the Automobile Competition Committee of the United States. IMSA, which is sports cars in North America. IHRA is the International Hot Rod Association, another drag racing association. They were the World Karting Association, and so on. So we can see this increase there in the number and types of forms of racing there in this sanctioning bodies list I compiled. Even further, the numbers and types of events increase. So this is just a list. Let's see this, active racetrack names. So this is tracks that are still active, still in existence. So there's a lot of them that have faded away. And so this is a list I compiled, and I looked and tried to find what year they were open. You can also see a building boom associated with this post-World War II boom. And these are very, mostly dirt tracks. But what this is also a lot of rural towns. And so here, not only, we see the numbers of spectators. They're not going to build racetracks unless there's people that are going to come there. And so if you build it, they will race, as they say. So car, no longer a luxury item, so people could afford it. And so that meant this rise in this weekly racing, short track, local racing, grassroots racing. And so a lot of this is from, some pent-up demand. There wasn't a lot of racing in the Great Depression era. Of course, World War II, not going to have a lot of racing. So there's pent-up demand. People want to see racing. And so also, with the numbers of participants increase. And so people have more extra money to go to the racetrack. Yeah, hey, I can afford to go to the racetrack. Hey, give me something to do. I want to smell that fuel. I want to smell that racing fuel. So what this does is this really increases across the country, but rural areas. You really see these racetracks pop up, kind of and just a promoter. It's a developer wants to turn their land into a racetrack, and they go for it. They convert it, and they spend the money. They get the investors and go for it. So we see this really take off here in Indiana. Probably the most popular form of racing right after World War II in the United States was midget racing. Once again, midget racing is that grassroots racing, oval, short track, open wheel. And so the name kind of has some connotations, but whatever. So these are very, very small, but very, keep in mind costs, very accessible. So these popped up all over the country. And so just in 1946, I mean, that's not soon after, very soon after the end of World War II, you had 250 active tracks in the United States. You could see races every single night. These races weren't just, 4 or 5 people. No, these were about 50 to 60 cars were racing. So we think about participation. Very, very, very high numbers, and compare that to today. So you can see the spectators. So these tracks were found anywhere. And a lot of them were abandoned horse tracks, converted, into race tracks. But this is, a very, very popular form of racing right after World War II. Another affordable form of racing, a version of stock car racing, was called jalopy, Jalopy. So there's, from 48 to 55, about 2,000 brand new jalopy tracks that were constructed, or, a lot of times they're like maybe baseball diamonds that were converted into racetracks. So you had these 2,000 tracks that were essentially created for very, very grassroots stock car racing. What's going on here? Why? Why these particular types of cars? Well, first off, you had new car production in the United States skyrocketed. So people were buying new cars that were just better. And first off, they're new cars. People could afford them. So you had a lot of these older cars that were left over. And so further, a lot of these older cars were left over from the 30s and 40s, a lot of spare parts. So if you wrecked it, no big deal. So because you had a lot of excess cars and parts, you could go racing pretty affordably. Now, today, these are bombers or Hornets, or strictly style. So for those of you who follow this type of racing, it still exists, and it's very grassroots level. But these jalopy tracks, I mean, they were built anywhere. Like I said, football stadiums, they were building baseball diamonds, farm fields, middle of nowhere, rural areas, no grandstands, bring your picnic tables, bring your picnic chairs, come watch the race. So, a lot of these tracks, are no longer in existence. They're today lost tracks, but some of them still, to this day, survived. I like this image here because it shows, it hits on a few things we've already discussed. First off, that Great Depression era. Bloomington Speedway was originally constructed in 1923 as a half-mile dirt track. And we can see that oval here, that outer oval is that half mile. And so it was built in 1923, which was great. That was nice at the time, but then came the Great Depression. So this track obviously sat and pretty much idled, and wasn't used for several years. Then came World War II. Then came the boom in racing after World War II, and so in 1947 it was reborn again as this quarter-mile dirt track that we see is the shape today. So it essentially uses the same front stretch there for a small portion of that smaller oval inside. So what this does, and then you can see the grandstand also was built accordingly. So what we can see here is two things. Kind of that Great Depression era, so that track is no longer being used. And we had this boom, especially in short track, especially very short track, quarter-mile track racing that came after World War II. Here's a current, or somewhat current, aerial photograph of Bloomington Speedway. And just see if you can see the bigger oval still to this day. Somewhat, barely, very faintly, you can still see evidence of that bigger oval, in which the smaller quarter-mile dirt oval that we see today fit inside. What in the world does an airport have to do with anything? Hendricks Field. This was a World War II air base that was essentially built. It was constructed for big, huge planes to land. We can see those planes here in this old dated postcard. So these big, huge, wide concrete patches for these big planes to land. But one of the things was, after World War II, we have no more war. What do we do? And so a lot of airports across the country that were built for military purposes were soon abandoned after World War II. So what do you do with them? Well, you might as well turn them into a racetrack if you're not going to use them to fly military bomber planes and big, huge planes. So that's what they did in Sebring. So Sebring in 1950, via a guy named Ullman, created the Sebring International Raceway, which uses these bright white concrete airport patches still to this day. So the airport we see over to the side, that's black, that's still in operation, but the ones we see over here to the left in the middle, those are abandoned airports or runway space. It's no longer used for airplanes, but it's today used for cars, for automobile racing. In particular, endurance racing. So here we see the crowd from the 12 Hours of Sebring, which is a 12-hour endurance race, which happens every March. So it's sports cars. It varies. Sometimes it's just a national level race. Sometimes it's an elite level race. It just depends on the year. So it changes as the sports car calendar changes. But this particular track and venue is also useful for testing, and so it gets a lot of use year-round. So it's an abandoned airport that's been turned into a racetrack, in which it's very useful for open-wheel testing. So they don't race here, but they do test here. Some open-wheel series do race here grassroots level, but IndyCar, Formula One do not race here, although Formula One and IndyCar both do have a history here. Sports car racing became very popular in the United States after World War II. Once again, sports cars, those are going to be like Ferraris, Mercedes, Jaguars, Corvettes, yada, yada, yada. So high-performance cars that we can actually purchase if you can afford it. So not Indy cars, open wheel, not Formula One cars. And so sports car racing became quite popular. And so Watkins Glen, New York, and Elkhart Lake, they held races on their public streets. So these races drew spectators. Well, we can see the route here in Elkhart Lake of one of the races in 1950, and these races were, in the case of Elkhart Lake, was sanctioned by the Sports Car Club of America, SCCA, Chicago branch. In 1952, out in Watkins Glen, on their public road circuit, a spectator was killed. So the government said, United States government, no more of this public road racing. You got to take it to some private venues, some controlled, closed circuits. And so what they did in Elkhart Lake was, in 1955, they built a very popular track called Road America, and it's a road course we see here inside the yellow box, and it's a very long, it's actually 4 miles, so it makes it look small compared to the old venue, but it's a purpose-built road course venue that was built for race cars, which once again, newly constructed, so not using public roads. Here is Mid-Ohio Sports Car Course, a natural terrain road course that was constructed in 1962 by a wealthy dude who had some investors and had some other wealthy businessmen who were wanting to race their sports cars. And essentially, they were, this is an example of a country club venue that was extremely exclusive. And so these guys were just built this asphalt road course out in the middle of nowhere, north of Columbus, south of Cleveland, just so they could race their sports cars. Now, a lot of these were, guys who were stationed in Europe, and so they became aware of European sports cars, Ferraris, Aston Martins, Mercedes. So they became aware of these high-performance brands that weren't really as popular in the United States up until the 1950s and 60s. And so with that, there was an affinity for these sports cars. A lot of them collected them. You collect them, you want to race them. And so then there became an interest in sports car racing across the country. And so sports car racing, a lot of it could be said, grew out of those GIs who were stationed in Europe and became aware of these sports cars, became aware of Le Mans, for example, as a type of racing, as a style of racing, endurance racing, and then essentially brought that back with them as they came back to the United States. And so Mid-Ohio Sports Car Case was later purchased by another guy who then turned it into a place that, could be where they put grandstands and tickets and big events and parking lots and all of that as we know it today. I ask you, what racetrack is this? Which famous racetrack is this? And you see it's in a very swampy area, although it's a black and white swampy area with this curvy road to the front. That'd be Daytona. So Daytona would be another example of a race course, racetrack that was built and constructed in this post-World War II boom. And so Daytona, as always, it's had racing for a long amount. We've talked about that beforehand. But the racing was brought to a closed venue, a venue also in which they could do another thing, go really, really fast. And once again, fast is what puts butts in the seats, especially here in the 1950s and 60s. And so this is, some super duper speeds in which stock cars could go essentially as fast as they wanted to. And so here a purpose-built oval, and of course Roval, as we've talked about beforehand, that Daytona International Speedway also has that road course in the middle, is another example of this post-World War II construction boom in venues. And finally, we have Indianapolis Raceway Park, which it's had a few different names. I don't know what it's known as now, but it's the one over in Claremont. It's where they have the U.S. Nationals drag race, the biggest drag race in the world. And it's also where they have a lot of midget and sprint car racing on the oval. They also had a rally car race there as well. But anyway, so this is interesting because this is kind of it's new age, kind of 1958. So it's kind of definitely much more thought, unlike using it in an abandoned airport. This is purpose built, in which it was designed to be multi types of racing venues. And so here we see a drag strip. There, we see that, and that's a good thing. Once again, drag racing, bringing it to closed venues. It's definitely safer. It's also legal, and so it's kind of, we see these purpose-built drag strips really start to pop up in 1958. So relatively old in a drag strip world. We also have the purpose-built oval, which is a paved oval, which doesn't get a lot of action, especially compared to used to back in, let's say, the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. So it's definitely seen a decline, especially with NASCAR pulling some of the events from there. We also have, a lot of people don't realize, a purpose-built road course that's built there. This is, big events back in the day. And IndyCar used to race here, good amount back in the day. And don't see really any racing there. But once again, this is built to be multi types of venues. There's even a motocross track that is no longer in use, but was constructed on site as well. And so, we see the racing capital of the world. Of course, we're going to have kind of a sophisticated venue like this that uses multiple types of racing.